He didn't lower his voice. He didn't spare her pride. "You will never be my wife," the Duke of Ravenshire said, and 100 crystal chandeliers seemed to freeze mid-sparkle. The winter season had come dressed as spring, all blossom-colored gowns and nervous laughter, and Grosvenor House had obliged by turning itself into a garden of light. Candle flames climbed the mirrored walls in polite astonishment. Violins threaded the air with ribbons of waltz. Gossip drifted like perfume, pleasantly poisonous. Lady Arabella Hartwell stood at the edge of the ballroom dais, with the serene posture of a woman who had taught her heart to behave in public. She wore robin's egg silk, modest pearls, and the kind of smile that looks like good breeding until one notices the bravery in it. Across the room, her future inked that afternoon in a tidy contract between two anxious families moved toward her with the inevitability of law. Adrian Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenshire, was handsome in the way cliffs are handsome, an architecture for the wind to argue with. His jaw looked carved rather than born. His eyes were the cold color of a winter river choosing not to thaw. People made way not because they feared him, but because they feared the truthful opinion he kept coiled behind his teeth. Arabella had known him since childhood, in the way the poor know palaces, by rumor and careful distance. She had seen him 3 times properly, once at a charity fair where his donation was precise and joyless, once at a hunt where he killed nothing but conversation, and once at a funeral where he looked most alive. She had told herself, as sensible girls do, that marriage is a craft. One learns it, then practices until the vessel floats. She had also, secretly, saved a corner of herself for the unlikely miracle of being seen. Now he stopped before her, every eye in the room hitching its courage to his composure. His bow was textbook correct, no music wasted itself on the gesture. "Lady Arabella," he said, voice polished to a military shine. "Your Grace." The 2 words tasted like prayer forced through a keyhole. There should have been sweet speeches, the smiling surrender to a dance, a murmur through the crowd as the future arranged its flowers. Instead, the Duke looked past her, beyond her, as if measuring the distance to a door only he could see. "I will speak plainly," he said. Arabella felt the air lean closer. "Please do." Our engagement exists to rescue both our houses from arithmetic," he said, each syllable clicking into place like a lock, deciding the sound of certainty. "I accept its necessity, and I will honor my end of the arrangement. Protection, provision, a name that will not be mocked. But let no one hear, least of all, you misunderstand me." He lifted his chin by the same fraction one might lift a sword. "You will never be my wife. With the no one here, least of all, you will never be my wife." The room did not gasp. It inhaled and forgot how to exhale. A violin string snapped somewhere behind the palms. Someone's jeweled fan clicked closed like a judge folding his glasses. Arabella did not move. A lady well-trained can hold her spine as if it were a vow. Inside that posture, however, her heart performed a violent inventory. Humiliation, present. Fury, present. Grief, refusing to check in with the footman. When one is publicly wounded, one must choose whether to bleed or to bloom. Arabella allowed her lips to curve a fraction. "What an extraordinary economy, Your Grace," she said, voice soft enough that only the nearest eavesdroppers would catch it first. "A husband who offers a marriage in which a wife is not required." Color did not visit his face. "I offer honesty, and usefulness." She extended her gloved hand, as though inviting him to pick up what he had dropped. "Shall we dance, so the room has something prettier to remember?" For a heartbeat he looked almost startled, then took her hand. Murmurs scattered like startled birds as he led her to the floor. The orchestra, grateful to be instructed, found a waltz. They turned 1, 2, 3, his palm at her waist correct and distant, her fingertips on his shoulder like punctuation that refuses to flatter the sentence. "Why do you hate me?" she asked, without the decoration of indignation. "I do not hate you." His tone made the verb sound vulgar. "I hate arrangements that pretend to be love. I hate the part of me that prefers rescue to risk." "Ah," she said lightly, "so I am a map when you hoped for a cliff." That earned her an angle of mouth one could almost call a smile. "You are quick." "I have had practice," she said. "Speed is how a woman outruns humiliation." "Does it work?" "Tonight," she replied. "We shall discover." Around them the room resumed its manners. Fans flirted with air. Men pretended to discuss horses. Chaperones recalibrated their daughters. Arabella focused on the geography of the dance, the safe arithmetic of steps. She did not look at the gallery where her mother stood proud, pale, relieved. She did not look at the bankers admiring their own benevolence or at the young ladies dispatching sympathy like poisoned sugar. She looked at the Duke who had just rebuilt her future into something cold and navigable and refused to be navigated by it. "Why announce it?" she asked, still smiling as if discussing weather. A cruelty performed in a corner would have sufficed. "I prefer witnesses," he said. "They keep history accurate." "Or convenient," she suggested. He did not answer. For 3 measures they moved without strategy, a machine built for beauty. Then, as he guided her through a turn, his glove brushed the inside of her wrist, where the pulse argues for what the brain rejects. His jaw tightened. When he spoke again, his voice had changed by the width of a breath. "Do not mistake me," he said. "I will not dishonor you. You shall have my name, my protection, my respect." And your absence," she completed gently. He inclined his head. "Yes." The waltz ended. They bowed, the crowd lifted its artful murmur, and the cut glass of the moment dissolved into small talk. Ravenshire escorted her to the dais and left her there, precisely as he had promised. Provision without presence. Ladies swarmed, their pity washed and perfumed. "My dear," cooed Mrs. Greystoke, who collected other people's tragedies the way gentlemen collect dogs. How very modern of him. "You must be quite relieved." Arabella thanked her for the compliment she had not paid and moved toward the terrace where Eyre had not yet been told how to behave. The night outside was scandalously honest. Cold pinpricks of January stars ignored the ballroom's golden argument. Arabella set both hands on the stone railing and let the winter find her cheeks. It did not ask for permission. She closed her eyes only once, and allowed herself the luxury of a hurt face. Then she straightened and spoke, not to a person but to the future that had just been rewritten. "Very well," she said quietly. "If I am not to be your wife, your grace, then I shall be your lesson." The door creaked. She did not turn. She knew the Duke's footfall now, a silence that altered other silences. But it was not he who joined her. Lord Silas Radcliffe, Ravenshire's oldest friend and most inconvenient conscience, came to lean on the balustrade a polite distance away. He was the kind of man who looked amused even when he was premature with sorrow. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was practiced," Arabella answered. "Same thing in London." He studied her profile. He is not a cruel man, only a frightened one who has decided on cruelty as prophylactic, as not phoritic. "That is a great many syllables to excuse a very simple sentence," she said. He chose to announce a desert. Radcliffe's gaze softened. "He believes deserts keep people alive." "And I," Arabella said, "have made gardens out of worse." When she returned to the ballroom, she did what strong women do when the world attempts to fold them. She unfolded others. She danced with a widower, complimented a wallflower, laughed with a debutante until the girl remembered laughter is not a sin. She became in a dress the color of forgiving sky the most indomitable ornament in the room. Every smile cost, but she paid in the only currency she could afford, interest. Across the floor, Ravenshire watched her the way soldiers watch weather. He stood perfectly still and betrayed himself with nothing but his eyes. When, toward the end of the evening, the orchestra essayed a final reel and guests began to loosen their spines, he made a small movement as if to cross to her, then arrested it. Restraint became his most public virtue. "Shall I send the carriage, my lady?" the Hartwell butler murmured at her elbow. "Not yet," Arabella said, gaze never leaving the Duke. "I wish to watch the night finish what the day began." She lifted a glass of something that glittered and did not drink. In the reflection, she saw the man she was to marry, the one who had promised her sanctuary and solitude in the same breath. She smiled at him across the sea of politeness and made a promise the room would not hear. "You will never be my husband as you define the word, but you may yet become my home if you dare to learn the grammar." Behind her, the musicians closed their instruments like books. Guests departed in carriages that rehearsed discretion. When at last the chandeliers surrendered their last gold to the mirrors, she allowed herself to be led to her mother's waiting shawl. "Well, my love?" Lady Hartwell asked, voice pitched to gentleness and strategy. "Ravenshire has offered me a kingdom without doors," Arabella said. "I intend to sketch windows." And somewhere, across town in a room without music, the Duke sat alone, fingers curled around a glass he did not drink. hearing again the two words he had spoken with such practiced certainty, never and wife, and discovering that the first did not fit comfortably beside the second, when the mouth that received it belonged to a woman who would not break. The city slept, the contract ink dried, and fate, which prefers irony to idleness, sharpened its quill for the chapter in which one kiss would teach a scholar of restraint how to conjugate surrender. They married on a Tuesday because Tuesdays are difficult to romanticize. The rector's voice was competent, the ink obedient, the witnesses forgettable. It was the kind of wedding that makes good sense on paper and poor sense in poetry. The Duke of Ravenshire said the words as if laying brick. Lady Arabella Hartwell answered as if planting seeds in stony ground and trusting weather she could not command. Ravenshire Manor received its new mistress like a lion instructed to purr. The facade was a sweep of honeyed stone, the windows tall as sermons, the gardens disciplined into obedience. Inside, everything operated on the theology of silence. Carpets that swallowed footsteps, clocks that apologized for ticking, servants who communicated chiefly with eyelids. Lady Hartwell had cried in the carriage, and then apologized to her daughter for the indulgence. Arabella had taken both her mother's hands and said, "We will not measure this marriage in tears. We will measure it in rooms I make livable." The first dinner was a negotiation disguised as soup. The table could have seated a regiment. It hosted 2 people and a battalion of candlesticks instead. Ravenshire discussed the barley harvest, the new foals, a repairs bill for the north roof. Arabella asked questions that made those subjects admit feelings: how the tenants had borne the late frost, whether the stable boys had boots that did not leak, if Mrs. Dalrymple in the village had recovered from her confinement. He watched her quietly, as one watches rainfall decide whether it intends kindness or flood. When she said, "Shall we visit the cottages together in the morning?" he replied, "I ride at 6. You may take the barouche at 10. The pause that followed contained a small nation. Later, Mr. Pembroke the butler presented the house keys with a bow so careful it might have been a prayer. "Her Grace's office, if it please you," he murmured, indicating a bright room off the east corridor. There were ledgers on the desk and a vase that had not been told it was expected to hold flowers. Arabella lifted the top ledger, skimmed the neat columns, and saw through numbers to lives. The servants discovered quickly that their new mistress made a sport of asking impossible questions and then making them slightly less so. "How often does the laundry maid leave before the last tray is cleared?" "Too often," said the housekeeper, because her mother's cough grew worse after dark. "Why are the kitchen boys fed standing?" "Because the bench broke last winter, and no one thought to mend what propels other people's comfort." "How many candles does it take for Mrs. Tripp to read the menu without squinting?" 2. Apparently, she had been rationing herself to 1. Arabella did not issue edicts. She altered habits. The bench was mended within the day and painted within the week. The laundry maid was moved to an early shift. An extra candle appeared beside Mrs. Tripp's spectacles with a note, "Light is cheaper than errors." She inspected linens, tasted soup, praised exactly, and corrected gently. The staff began to look at her the way windows look at sun. The household, however, has 2 suns, and the other remained an eclipse. The Duke rose before dawn, rode hard, wrote harder, and returned each night looking as if he had negotiated privately with the day and lost on honorable terms. He thanked her when thanks were due, listened when listening was required, but he did not linger in rooms where warmth might be gathered. The east wing hers smelled of beeswax and lavender, the small domestic courage of women making spaces gentle. The west wing his smelled of tobacco and rain. They met at dinner like diplomats from neighboring countries whose maps disagree. Society, magnanimous as ever when observing other people's discomfort, sent invitations with friendly malice. Arabella accepted all of them. If her husband meant to write their marriage in invisible ink, she would learn to write legibly upon air. At Lady Cray's musicale she wore dove grey and listened with obedient delight while a soprano murdered Handel. Sir Thomas leaned over with a confidence that had not been earned. "Your Grace, rumour is a wicked child. Allow me to say how nobly you bear. Children are best ignored when they misbehave," Arabella replied, smiling so gently he did not notice the bruise on his pride until later. At the Ridley dinner, a sudden rain battered the windows into honesty. Conversation turned inward toward the sport society loves best, diagnosis. "Ravenshire," drawled a gentleman of the lazy opinion school, Has the look of a man allergic to matrimony. Laughter skittered like dice. Arabella set down her glass. Allergies are often cured by exposure, she said. In the meantime, one learns to keep flowers in the house and to open windows strategically. The table blinked. Someone changed the subject to opera. Later, as she stepped into her carriage, she felt eyes at her back and found Ravensher in the doorway, rain painting his shoulders with silver. He inclined his head a salute that admitted she had saved him from small wounds. He declined to notice, but could not quite ignore. Back at the manor, she walked the grounds with the head gardener and learned the names of things that thrive when compelled and those that only flourish when asked. She chose the latter for the beds beneath her windows. She revived the yellow drawing room with a dozen small, unremarkable mercies. Cushions that met the human back halfway, a rug that did not trip the unwary, a fire laid as if warmth were not a privilege but a right. She opened the long unused music cabinet and discovered a pianoforte good enough to keep secrets. By the end of a week, the instrument had remembered how to forgive. Servants found pretext to pass the door when she played. Even the clocks seemed to tick in time. Ravensher listened once from the corridor, spine against paneling, eyes closed. The melody reached the part of him that had been refusing mail. He left before it finished. On the 10th morning, Arabella rose at 5 and walked to the stables with a shawl and an argument. The stablemaster tried to stall her with weather. She smiled past him. Ravensher emerged from the tack room, fastening his gloves, startled into a half-bow he hadn't planned to spend. "You are up early," he said. "I am late," she corrected. "You ride at 6. Today I ride with you." His look traveled from her boots, sensible, to her seat, competent, to her face, incorrigible. "It is cold," he said, as if naming a law. "It is England," she replied, moving past him to the grey mare whose patience had her name invented on the spot. "Ready when you are, Your Grace." They rode out under a sky the colour of unripe pears. The fields received them with damp reluctance. At the top of the hill she drew even with him and pointed to the cluster of cottages by the river. "The roof on Cooper's place leaks in the east room," she said. "The baby sleeps there." He glanced sidelong. "I authorized repairs last quarter. Timber never met authorization it could not ignore," she said. "It requires a cart, coin, and someone who means it." He did not answer for 20 strides. Then, "Bring me the estimate tonight. I have it in my pocket." That earned her a quick breath that might one day become a laugh. "Of course you do." They crossed the stream at the ford and stopped where frost still held stubborn to the grass. For a moment, the world contracted to hoof-breath and the white plume of their speech. "Why do you work so hard to make this place human?" he asked, not unkindly, not quite curious, but something neighboring both. "Because houses are how men talk to the people they cannot hear," she said. "And because I refuse to be the ghost they expected when you said never." He looked at her then, really looked, as if memory were finally willing to take dictation from the present. "You are not a ghost," he said softly. "No," she answered, turning her mare toward home. "But I am excellent at haunting." The weeks made a habit of themselves. Arabella established a tenant's ledger separate from estate accounts, so needs could not drown in numbers. She converted a disused still room into a small infirmary, persuaded the village midwife to accept regular wages, and stocked a cupboard with remedies labelled in a hand anyone could read. She convinced the steward to trial sharecropping on 3 poor fields and sent surplus vegetables to the schoolroom where arithmetic learned the taste of soup. Servants began reporting to her because she asked the sort of questions that turned labour into dignity. Children in the village practiced curtsies not to curtsy better, but because someone finally laughed with them while they did it. The rector preached a sermon on meekness and found his congregation unexpectedly attentive when Arabella arrived with blankets and did not stay to be thanked. None of this melted the Duke. It thinned him. Guarded men do not surrender, they erode. Some evenings he stood in the doorway of the yellow drawing room and watched the lamplight make a vocation of her face. Once, returning very late, he paused outside her office and saw through the crack of the door her head drooping over figures, a candle guttering near her sleeve. He stepped in, quietly, and moved the candle to safety. She stirred, opened her eyes, and found him smiling without practice. "You are tired," he said. "You are observant," she answered, and the small joke fitted them with unexpected ease. He left a parcel on her desk the next morning, riding gloves lined against the cold, stitched with her initials. No note. She wore them without comment and forgave the omission as one forgives weather. Society kept attending them with barbed kindness. At the Pennick's dinner, a gentleman made a joke that required Arabella to be present and women to be absent. She replied with a line about arithmetic that sent laughter rolling in her favor, and saw the Duke's hand tighten once upon his glass, not with anger but with surprise, as if he'd encountered a species of loyalty he hadn't purchased and therefore did not know how to store. In the privacy of his study, he wrote a letter to Lord Silas Radcliffe and burned it. In the privacy of her dressing room, she looked at herself in the mirror and practiced not apologizing for wanting to be loved. On a rain-polished afternoon, the housekeeper brought news of Mrs. Cooper's infant coughing through the night. Arabella wrapped bread and broth and walked down herself. She returned at dusk mud-splashed, hair unpinned, cheeks bright with cold and purpose. Ravenshire met her on the steps without meaning to. "You went," he said. "I go," she corrected. It is a verb of habit. He opened his mouth to issue a Duke's precaution and closed it again. "Was the baby breathing easier when I left? They need a stove, not prayer alone." She tipped her face up, rain purling on her lashes. "May I order it?" "You may," he said, and after a heartbeat added, "Thank you." It was the second time he had said those words since their marriage. The first had been for a ledger. This time, it was for the education of his own heart. That night, she played the piano-forte softly pieces that did not ask conversation to explain itself. He listened from the corridor, then entered as if approaching wild birds. "Miss Hartwell," he said, forgetting he had promised never to use the name the law had replaced. She looked up, smiling a little. "Your Grace?" He hesitated. "You are good at making the manor feel less like a verdict." "Give me time," she said. "I shall make it a home that forgives." He nodded once, as men nod when asked to believe in weather beyond their science, and left her with the music and a candlestick that did not need escort. They slept that night as they always did. Doors closed, wings separate, the house between them like a continent they were pretending not to map. But somewhere just before sleep found her, Arabella felt it the smallest tectonic shift. Not warmth, not yet, but a lessening of winter's arrogance. In the dark, far away in the West Wing, Ravenshire lay awake and discovered a novelty. The word never had begun to taste unreliable. Rain had a way of confessing what people hid. It erased disguises, drew honesty from the soil, and left everything more naked than it intended to be. It was on one such night, as rain stitched its grey threads across the windows of Ravenshire Manor, that Lady Arabella learned the shape of her husband's wound. She had gone in search of the steward to review the new accounts from the tenants, but voices from the library halted her outside the door. One belonged to Lord Silas Radcliffe, the Duke's closest friend, that dangerous mixture of wit and conscience. The other, unmistakably, was her husband's, clipped, tense, and trying too hard not to tremble. "You should go back to London," Ravenshire was saying. "The country air makes you too honest." "I prefer honesty to cowardice," Radcliffe answered, not unkindly. "You married a remarkable woman, Adrian. Why insist on treating her as punishment?" "Arabella froze." "Because she deserves better than what's left of me," came the Duke's voice, quieter now. "You think I don't see it? Every time she smiles, it mocks what I destroyed. I tried love once. It buried a woman." Radcliffe sighed. "Clara's death was an accident." Ravenshire's reply was like broken glass. "Accidents are only fate wearing good manners. I drove her to it. My temper, my pride. If Arabella is wise, she'll learn from her predecessor's mistake." The silence that followed was long enough to grow old in. When she heard footsteps, Arabella slipped back down the corridor before they emerged. Her hands shook as she reached her chambers. Clara. The name was not new, whispered by servants, embroidered on gossip, but hearing it from his own lips changed its weight. It was no longer myth. It was marrow. That night she didn't sleep. The house exhaled around her old timbers, sighing, the sea wind slipping through cracks, rain reciting its endless apology. She sat by the fire and stared into it until the coals turned thoughtful. So this was his secret. Love turned to loss, loss turned to armor. The next morning, she rose early and walked the gardens, letting the wet air cleanse the ache in her chest. She found Ravenshire near the stables, speaking to a groom, his coat dark from rain. For a moment, she watched him unseen. He looked tired, Not the fatigue of the body, but the exhaustion of a man forever outrunning memory. When he noticed her, he straightened, mask immediately in place. "You shouldn't be out in this weather." "It's only water," she said. "It reminds me that I'm alive." His eyes flickered, something unreadable there, then gone. "You're pale. You should rest." She smiled faintly. "I find rest is for people without purpose. I've too much of both." He said nothing. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not cruel. That evening, the storm returned with vengeance. The manor seemed to lean into it, the wind dragging its voice along the eaves. Arabella passed the Duke's study and saw the door slightly ajar. Inside, the fire burned low, throwing restless shadows across the shelves. He sat at his desk, a decanter untouched beside him, his face illuminated only by candlelight. She meant to leave, but then saw what lay before him, a small ivory miniature of a young woman with laughing eyes and golden hair. He touched the portrait as if afraid it might burn him. "Clara," he whispered, "I failed you once, and now I fail her." Arabella's throat tightened. She didn't move until he leaned back, running a hand through his hair, the gesture of a man at war with ghosts. She left quietly, heart pounding not from jealousy, but sorrow. The next day, she asked the housekeeper about the garden Clara had once tended. "It was her pride," Mrs. Ellis said softly. "The rose garden by the lake. After she died, His Grace forbade anyone to touch it." "Show me," Arabella said. The garden was a graveyard of neglect. Thorns ruled where beauty once lived. Roses strangled themselves for want of care. The air smelled of memory and mildew. Arabella knelt in the wet soil, heedless of her gown. "You poor, stubborn things," she whispered. "He loved you once. I will make him remember." For days she worked there in secret, cutting, pruning, coaxing life from ruin. The gardener tried to protest. She silenced him with a smile that knew its mission. Slowly, green returned to grey, buds to bare stems. When the first bloom opened a rose, the colour of forgiveness, she placed it in a small glass vase on the Duke's desk. No note, just the flower. That evening, she found the vase gone. The next morning, another appeared, this time with 2 roses inside. Neither spoke of it. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted. He no longer dined in silence. Once, he even asked, "You've been in the gardens?" "I have. They look improved." "I thought it time they stopped mourning." He studied her a long moment, then said, "You remind me of her sometimes." Arabella met his gaze evenly. "Then you should look more carefully. I am nothing like your ghost." His breath caught. "Perhaps that's what I fear most." The words hung between them, fragile and alive. That night, she dreamed of a man who built walls to keep from drowning, and of a woman determined to turn them into bridges. The next morning, while he was out riding, she entered the West Gallery, a room of portraits, locked memories. At the end hung Clara's likeness, life-sized and vivid, her smile frozen in eternal spring. Arabella stood before it and spoke aloud, though the only audience was dust and paint. "I am not here to replace you," she said softly, "only to teach him how to live with what remains." Behind her the door creaked. She turned. Ravensshire stood there, rain still in his hair, his expression unreadable. "You should not be in this room," he said, but the edge in his voice had dulled. "I wanted to meet her," Arabella replied. He hesitated, then stepped closer, eyes shadowed. She was kind, reckless. The world adored her, and she— His voice broke. "She fell because of me." Arabella shook her head gently. "No, my lord. She fell because grief is heavier than air. You simply tried to catch it." He stared at her, something shifting behind his guarded gaze. "Why do you care?" "Because someone must," she said, "and because love is not a crime, even when it ends." For a heartbeat, the storm outside paused. He looked as though he might speak, but instead, he turned away, gripping the back of a chair as if to keep himself from collapsing. When he finally met her eyes again, his voice was a whisper. "You should hate me." "I would," she said, "if I didn't see how much you already do." He closed his eyes. The smallest sound escaped him, half laugh, half sob. It was the first time she had ever seen him human. Spring arrived at Ravensshire like an apology written in blossom. The hedgerows exhaled white lace, lambs rehearsed their clumsy leaps, and even the sullen river learned to glitter where it used to remember storms. Arabella, who had grown expert at translating seasons into small salvations, declared that the tenants' foals deserved admiration, and that admiration required both a picnic and the reluctant attendance of a duke. Ravensshire came armed with restraint and a ledger, which is to say he was underdressed for merriment. They travelled with Lord Radcliffe and half a dozen grooms through fields that had forgiven winter, down to the shallow ford where the river had the courtesy to be scenic. Children appeared as if the countryside had been hiding them for the reveal. Women waved with hands that had earned the right. Men doffed their caps to gratitude more than rank. Arabella moved among them with a queen's humility, accepting jam, praising cabbages, remembering names. The Duke watched, the way a soldier watches weather that might soften the ground. The picnic became a rehearsal for a future the hall had not believed in. Bread that dared to be warm, cold chicken that tasted like a holiday, a tart Lord Radcliffe declared immoral and ate twice. The sky ran out of threats and settled for blue. Arabella knelt to show a girl how to hold a skittish foal's halter. "Gently," she said, "but as if you mean it. That is the secret to most things one cares about." When she looked up, she found Ravensshire watching her with the expression of a man discovering a map to a country he thought mythical. "Walk with me," she said, rising and brushing grass from her skirts. He hesitated a second too long, then his obedience remembered mercy. They followed the river where it widened to a silver ribbon. Willows wrote, cursive, into the water. "You have changed this place," he said at last, as if admitting weather to the record. "I have taught it to remember people live here," she replied. "Houses forget that unless you remind them with soup and laughter." "Soup," he repeated, tasting the word as if it might be a philosophy. "And laughter." They stood on the low stone bridge that had been mended, twice, and promised to behave. Below, the river took its time over pebbles. Arabella leaned against the parapet, hair escaping its pins with the insubordination of joy. "You are almost kind when you aren't trying to be," she said lightly. "Almost?" His mouth tilted, failed to become a smile, tried again. "That seems ambitious." "Ambition is for dukes," she said. "I settle for evidence." The evidence, at that precise moment, was the way he looked at her. Not like a contract, not like an obstacle, like a man audits his own breath and finds he prefers it in her vicinity. He reached for the edge of the parapet instead of her hand, and she forgave him even for that. Then the moment, obliging as ever to narrative, decided to test its subjects. A tenant boy, pelted by giddy courage, raced his cob across the shallows on the far side of the bridge, where the stream narrowed and leapt. The cob stumbled, the boy slid, reins tangled. The water, shallow but hurried, caught more than it returned. Arabella moved before sense could stage an intervention. "Hold the head up," she called, skirts already bunched in her hands. She was down the bank and into the water in 3 breaths. Cold grabbed her calves like an argument. The current shoved with cheerful disregard. She reached the boy as the cob floundered, and found the reins with the deliberation of a woman who has no intention of letting physics bully a child. "Give me your hand," she told the boy, voice calm enough to unclench panic. He did. She planted her feet, felt the pebbles mutiny, and pulled. The horse lurched, found purchase, scrambled. The boy came free with a crow of shock. "Up you go," she urged, pushing him toward the bank, "and tell your mother I owe her a telling off." She had just enough time to think herself victorious when her heel met a rock that had been waiting all winter for this exact theater. Her ankle turned. The river, offended, took its chance. The world pivoted. The sky found itself underfoot. Water inserted itself into her lungs with the entitlement of an unwelcome guest. She did not scream. She would not remember how. Ravensshire did. He was in the water before Lord Radcliffe's oath had finished choosing adjectives. The cold bit, but grief had taught him older teeth. He ignored them. He saw her white sleeve flash, then vanish, then surface again near the tumble of stones below the bridge, where the current snarled. Memory black carriage, broken wheel. A scream rose to drown him. He swam through it and insisted on the present. "Arabella," he shouted, and the name, spoken as if it were the only word the language kept, showed him where to go. She fought once, twice, then went limp the way people do when they decide trust is quicker than instructions. He reached her, found the fabric at her shoulder, then the reality of her body, and gathered her into the fact of his arms. "Breathe," he commanded, though he did not know to whom. He turned her, lifted her head above the greedy drag, kicked toward the shallows with the conviction of a man literate in rescue. Pebbles grated his knees when he reached the bank. He welcomed the pain as proof of geography. The boy's mother wailed. The horse sneezed. Radcliffe arrived with a coat and a profanity. None of it entered the circle where the Duke's hands learned to tremble. Arabella coughed, sputtered River, opened her eyes. They were wide, astonished, alive. He was above her, hair dark with water, mouth parted as if he had just taught himself breath. "You saved me," she whispered, which was inaccurate. He had saved himself from a second life sentence. "No," he said, and his voice broke on the truth. "I'm the one who's drowning." Something in her face changed, not pity, recognition. She reached, found his cheek with wet fingers, and smiled the smallest smile available to humanity. "Then come up," she murmured. He did not think. For once, thinking had the courtesy to step aside. He bent, and the world, which had been crowded with people and weather and old noise, reduced itself to the small, private miracle of her mouth. The first kiss was collision fear, relaxing into hunger, apology dissolving into need. It tasted of river and winter, and the heat that lives under both. Waiting. He meant to be careful and failed immediately. She meant to be brave and succeeded extravagantly. When his hand slid to her neck, she arched into life. When her fingers closed in the fabric at his shoulders, he understood the grammar of surrender his body had been pretending not to study. "Adrian," she breathed against him, and his name unused, untrusted, flowered in her mouth and became an invitation to exist. He answered it with a tenderness that surprised even the part of him that had learned to be cruel for safety. The kiss changed, less desperate, more declarative. The sky, having nothing better to do, remembered to be blue again. They parted because oxygen is tyrannical. He rested his forehead against hers, laughing once helplessly, the sound of a man who has just been forgiven by a universe he had sued for damages. "I told you never," he said, voice roughened into honesty. "And then you taught me how little that word knows." She shivered, not from cold, from relief. He wrapped Radcliffe's coat around her, hands steadier now that they had learned new work. The boy, suitably chastened and presently in possession of a sermon he would repeat to grandchildren, stood sobbing with wet heroism. "Are you hurt?" Ravenshaw asked, searching the length of her with a doctor's panic. "Only improved," she said. "My ankle is sulking." He lifted her, as if gravity had been invented for other people. "Then we must see to its manners." He carried her up the bank, through a corridor of astonished silence that left room for gratitude, and set her on a tartan Radcliffe pretended he had spread with foresight. The tenants, who had begun the day believing dukes were cold weather and duchesses were decorative, revised their theology to include rescue and reciprocity. Mothers dabbed, children stared. Men who did not commend other men found themselves nodding. Radcliffe, handing over a flask as if sacrament, muttered, "At last," and the look Arabella and Adrian exchanged agreed with him without admitting jurisdiction. The ride home took an hour and no time at all. He held her in the carriage, not because she needed holding, she did, but because he needed the education. She watched the water drying in his hair, the line of his jaw unclenching its old verdicts. "You are allowed to live," she said softly, as if telling a child a secret. He swallowed. "I have not known how." "I will teach you," she replied. "Payment is due in kisses." He closed his eyes, as if prayer required darkness, and said, "I am a quick study." Back at the manor, the doctor pronounced the ankle merely offended. Orders were issued. Rugs were warmed. Tea conspired with brandy. When at last they were alone, yellow drawing room, fire remembering how to be a hearth, he sat beside her and did not pretend distance. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About marriage, about you, about the utility of never." She touched his hand, gloveless now. "Human. I was wrong too. I thought I wanted a husband. I wanted a man. And now?" His voice fell to an octave that confesses. "Now," she said, and leaned in. "I want you." The second kiss did not ask permission of the past. It wrote a future in a language two people had invented together between a river and a room. When they paused, she rested her palm against his cheek, and he turned into it with a gratitude that looked like worship and did not embarrass either of them. "Stay," she whispered, "meaning in this room, in this marriage, in his life." "I cannot imagine leaving," he answered, and for once the word cannot was kind. Outside, The first swallows of spring drew stitches in the evening sky. Inside, a vow older than law, newer than breath, stitched two lives into something garments envy. The river had given them back to each other, but London had not forgotten how to take. News travels faster than forgiveness. Within a fortnight, the city that once mocked their loveless marriage now found something far juicier, a love too sudden to be decent. Invitations arrived scented with curiosity. Gossip papers printed the phrase, "The Drowned Duchess," as if romance were a scandal to be punished. Ravenshire ignored it at first. He worked the estate with a new steadiness, a man reclaiming his name through action rather than apology. Arabella didn't flinch at whispers. She smiled in markets, greeted gossips like guests, and spent her afternoons at the infirmary she had built with her own hands. But peace built on denial is a fragile thing, and one grey morning it cracked. A letter came sealed in black wax. The handwriting was elegant, merciless. To His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshire. You mistake the silence of the dead for your absolution. Clara Vale's memory demands justice. London shall hear it. Charles Vale. Arabella found him staring at the letter by the fire, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. "Who is he?" she asked. "Her brother," he said. The words left a taste of iron. "He was abroad when she died. He always believed his voice broke, that I drove her to it." She stepped closer. "Then he will hear the truth." Ravenshire laughed without humor. "Truth? He doesn't want truth. He wants vengeance dressed as righteousness. He'll get it. He always does." By the following week, London was drunk on rumor. Vale had returned with charm, letters, and witnesses who could recite tragedy as entertainment. He dined with editors, flirted with duchesses, and told the story of his poor, doomed sister whose husband's cruelty had killed her. Arabella's name followed his on every page. The new duchess in the old ghost's house. The portrait of Clara reprinted beside hers. Questions murmured over tea. Was it love or ambition? Is history repeating itself? Ravenshire tried to shield her by withdrawal letters unanswered. Invitations declined, but retreat only sharpened the claws of gossip. Arabella had lived through humiliation before. She refused to endure it again in silence. "We cannot hide," she told him one evening, voice steady though her hands trembled. "Silence looks too much like guilt." "And speech looks too much like vanity," he replied. "Then perhaps," she said, "we should start sounding vain." He stared at her, astonished by her defiance and her grace. "You would face them? The same people who feed on your name? I would feed them truth until they choke on it." The opportunity came sooner than she expected. The Duchess of Penworth invited them to her charity ball, ostensibly for orphans, truly for gossip. Declining would be confession, accepting would be war. They went. The ballroom glittered with hypocrisy, every jewel another lie polished to perfection. Arabella entered on her husband's arm, chin high, eyes unflinching. Her gown was ivory silk trimmed in gold, simple, radiant, unyielding. The crowd parted, half in admiration, half in appetite. Charles Vale found them within minutes. He bowed with the civility of a blade. "Your Grace," he said to Arabella, "you honor us with your presence. My sister would have been so pleased to see her replacement." Ravenshire's fist tightened, but Arabella's hand covered his before the storm could start. She met Vale's gaze evenly. "If your sister were here, Mr. Vale, I imagine she would tell you the dead have no use for your theatre." "Ah," he said, smiling, "so you do have a tongue. Tell me, Duchess, do you ever hear her name whispered in your hall? Does she haunt your marriage bed?" The orchestra faltered. The room leaned in. Arabella's reply was calm, almost kind. "No, Mr. Vale. Ghosts visit those who cannot forgive. I sleep beside a man who has learned how." Laughter rippled, nervous, unsure whom to favor. Vale's smile thinned. "Then perhaps you should read her letters before you claim sainthood." He tossed a packet of papers onto the table beside them. They landed like a challenge. "The originals," he said, "written by Clara, addressed to him, unread by you." Ravenshire's face drained of color. Arabella reached for the letters first. "Then it is time I do read them." She carried them home. He followed in silence. When she opened the first one, it trembled like a heartbeat. The words were desperate, written in a hand that had forgotten how to hope. "Forgive me, Adrian. I have been foolish. He promised to help us, to save us. I never meant to fall into ruin." The next was worse. He says if I leave, he will publish my letters. I cannot bear the shame. Better the river than the papers. Arabella's eyes blurred. She was being blackmailed. Ravenshire nodded, voice ragged. By a man named Halvan, wealthy, idle, married. When she refused him, he threatened her reputation. She ran. I found her too late. Then why not tell the world? She asked. Because her brother made me promise silence, he said bitterly. He said our family had suffered enough scandal. He took the letters and now uses them to damn me again. Arabella stood, fierce with clarity. Then we will take back her story. You don't know what you're saying. I know precisely. I will go to London. I'll find Halvern. If he's alive, he'll tell me the truth. He caught her wrist. I won't let you risk it. You have no choice, she said, and for the first time, he heard in her tone not defiance, but faith, the kind that saves men or destroys them. She left at dawn, accompanied only by her maid and her conviction. London welcomed her with rain and rumour. She found Lord Halvan easily. He had aged poorly on luxury. At first, he denied everything. Then Arabella placed Clara's letters on his desk and said, "If I must, I'll read them aloud at every salon in London. The world adores tragedy. Shall we give them the truth for once?" His face collapsed. "It was her brother's doing," he confessed. "He begged me to destroy the letters. He wanted to protect her name, not yours." Arabella's fury dissolved into sorrow, and instead he destroyed both. She returned to Ravenshire that evening, exhausted but triumphant. She handed him Halvan's signed confession and the packet of letters. "It's over," she whispered. He took her hands. "No, my love, it's begun." At the next gathering, Charles Vale appeared, proud and polished. But when Arabella entered, letters in hand, the room changed temperature. She placed the confession on the table before him. "Your sister died loved, not shamed," she said clearly. "And her memory deserves peace, not profit." Vale stared, the colour draining from his face as eyes turned toward him. Society, that fickle god, shifted allegiance. The whispers turned, and across the room, the Duke of Ravenshire, once the man who vowed never, looked at his wife as if seeing a miracle disguised in silk and courage. He bowed his head and said softly, "You've done what I could not. You've forgiven the dead and rescued the living." Arabella smiled faintly. "I told you truth was louder than scandal. Truth is a bell. Once struck, it keeps singing in rooms that swear they are soundproof." Halvan's confession cleaved London into two congregations, those who preferred their scandal seasoned with repentance, and those who resented being deprived of a villain. Editors who had polished the Duke's ruin for breakfast now printed corrections at supper with less appetite. Invitations returned, then hesitated, then arrived with footnotes. "Private concert. Discreet company. No speeches, please." Money, which loves courage only after it wins, still kept a cautious distance. The estate staggered like a boxer who has finally learned the other man's name. Ravenshire took losses on his feet. He sold 2 townhouses and the hunting box in Northumberland with the same calm he had once used to ignore happiness. He paid every creditor in full and early. "We will not buy our future by borrowing contempt," he told Arabella, and the look she gave him pride dressed as tenderness purchased a year of air. But men who have lived long in winter cannot recognize spring without flinching. The invitations that did come were tests disguised as charity. Lady Dorrington's musicale advertised forgiveness and delivered scrutiny. Lord Whitefield's supper was a duel conducted with teaspoons. Arabella navigated them like a ship that has studied the coast and refuses to be dashed. It was at the Ridleys, where opinions are served a course before soup, that the breaking point arrived. Charles Vale attended, immaculate as ever, contrition folded small enough to be misplaced. He did not approach them. His penance was to orbit their grace at a distance. The room had decided it liked Arabella better than it disliked reform, and for half an hour the future seemed to have agreed. Then a gentleman with more title than spine rose with his glass and proposed a toast to ladies whose virtue survives wicked dukes. The words were clumsy enough to pass for wit. Laughter applauded, thin, relieved, hungry. The old story, returned in costume. Ravenshire stood. He did not raise his glass. "Forgive me," he said, voice even, "but I have grown unfit for rooms that confuse cowardice with comedy." He took Arabella's hand, the gesture simple, public, unarguable, and continued, "I once told this woman she would never be my wife. That was not cruelty. It was fear incorrectly conjugated. Tonight, I correct it. She is my wife, not by contract, but by consent, not by silence, but by truth. If you would drink to anything, let it be to the end of convenient lies. He inclined his head and sat. The silence that followed was not shock, but recalculation. The company divided once more. Those who would remain their friends applauded. Those who would not chose the fig leaf of coughs. Arabella felt his hand loosen only after the danger passed. She leaned and whispered, "You were perfect." "I was human," he murmured. "It's exhausting." They left early. Outside, rain had polished the streets to sincerity. In the carriage, he turned to her with a boy's uncertainty smuggled into a duke's frame. "Have I made it worse?" "You have made it real," she said. "Real is louder than gossip, even if it takes longer to be heard." At home, the solicitor awaited with arithmetic that no one wished to recite. The estate could endure another season like this, perhaps two, before a sale of land would amputate the future at the thigh. Arabella listened, asked 3 questions that turned numbers into lives, and then looked at Adrian the way architects look at earthquakes, with respect and a plan. "We may leave this house," she said, "but we will not leave ourselves." "We could go to Italy," he said, half hopeful, half afraid of wanting anything. "They forgive weather there, and the sea teaches men to breathe," she replied. "But we will not flee. We will choose." He frowned slightly, as if tasting the difference. "Choose exile?" "Choose peace," she corrected, "whether it comes with roses or ruins." The next weeks were an exercise in honesty. They met with the steward and rearranged rents to protect the poorest tenants first. They sold the West Meadow to a neighbor who promised grass to the widow's herd at no charge. Arabella moved the infirmary to the village school so that medicine would not be a rumor but a room. Adrian dismissed 2 useless retainers and raised wages for the stable boys. He discovered that dignity is cheaper than charity and spends better. On a bright, cold morning, the banker who had shaped his mouth around the word regret since boyhood visited to explain that the credit extended to His Grace would hereafter be extended to Mr. Blackthorne, and at a rate less poetic. He left with his hat and a letter of apology he would never send. Adrian watched the carriage go and said, softly, "I am more myself as a man than I ever was as a duke." Arabella stepped beside him, slid her fingers into his, as if finishing a sentence. "Then keep being him." Spring widened. The roses in Clara's garden obeyed Arabella now and not grief. June arrived with its foolish confidence and brought with it the Penworth charity fete, the one event the county still believed in because it fed children before it fed gossip. Arabella insisted they go. "Not to be seen," she told him, "but to see. But to see." They walked among stalls and laughter, tasting cider that promised more than it delivered, buying ribbons they did not need. Children who had once practiced curtsies on shadows ran to tug Arabella's sleeve and show her pocket wonders. Adrian purchased 2 carved wooden horses from a boy whose father had fingerprints made of soot. He haggled badly on purpose and pretended not to. Then the accident happened, the kind fate uses to certify a story. A pavilion post loosened, canvas sagged, and a gust lifted the world. The tent toppled toward a cluster of children, one small girl frozen in the geometry of fear. Adrian moved first, as he had at the river, past memory, past calculation. He caught the beam on his shoulder, teeth clenched, breath steady. "Take her," he told Arabella, who was already there. She pulled the child free. Radcliffe braced the other side. Men sprang to help, and in seconds the danger was scolded back into timber. The crowd did the arithmetic, and then the applause. Mothers wept in relief. The girl, hair ribbon crooked, reached sticky hands toward the man who had just argued with gravity on her behalf. Adrian set the beam down and knelt so that his eyes met hers. "Brave," he said simply. The county changed its mind in that instant, not because heroism earns absolution, but because it reveals a habit of truth. People who had been willing to rent him villainy by the month suddenly remembered their ledgers had always miscounted grace. That night, by the open window of the yellow drawing-room, the air velvet with early summer, Arabella poured 2 small glasses of brandy and handed one to the man who had learned a new tense for love. "To never," she said, lifting hers. He smiled. "To its opposite. To now," she amended. They drank. He set his glass aside and took her hands. "I have a question," he said. voice steady as a vow. "It is not the sort one asks in a ballroom." "Good," she said, laughter a glimmer at the edge of devotion. "I am done with ballrooms." I told you you would never be my wife. I was wrong. Will you," he paused, searching for words that had learned humility, "will you be my partner in all the versions of our future, with titles or without, with land or only sea, with crowds or only quiet? I cannot promise comfort. I can promise honesty. And I can promise that when fear says never, I will teach it the grammar of with you." She did not tremble. She did not weep. She kissed him once slow, sovereign answer and anthem and said, "Yes," again, forever rewritten. The house seemed to hear them and relax. In the garden, a rose opened. It did not ask permission of the night. They planned the final act with deliberation rather than haste. They would host one more gathering at Ravenshire, small, untheatrical, a harvest supper for tenants, neighbours, and the handful of friends who had not required footnotes. They would announce the sale of the manor not as a surrender but as a commencement, proceeds to endow schools in the district and a fund for widows and apprentices. "Let them say we left a house and kept a county," Arabella said, and Adrian loved her for making nouns obey kindness. On the evening before the supper, they walked the long gallery where portraits practice immortality. He paused before Clara's likeness. Arabella did the honours. She drew the lightest veil across the frame, not to hide it, but to signal the end of public viewing. "Rest," she whispered. "We have learned how." He looked at his wife, and the word ceased being a legal category and became a geography. "You taught me," he said. "Then keep being a good student," she replied, smiling. "The final lesson is tomorrow." "What is it?" "Confession," she said, "and joy." He nodded. "Then I am ready." Outside, summer rehearsed the sound of harvest. Inside, two people held the present steady enough to invite a future. Harvest always begins with noise horses snorting, carts protesting, laughter pretending it has never met exhaustion. But that year, Ravenshire's fields hummed a quieter tune. The supper was held in the long barn, stripped of pretension, hung with lanterns and late roses. Barrels became tables, benches became diplomacy. Children darted like punctuation through sentences of conversation. Someone tuned a fiddle until it remembered melody. Arabella moved among them with the calm of a woman who has seen disaster turn obedient. She wore no tiara, no jewels, only a gown of soft green and the ring he had given her twice, once by law, once by love. She listened more than she spoke, touched shoulders lightly, accepted gratitude as if it were a loan to be repaid in kindness. Adrian watched her from the doorway. He had intended to make an entrance, some tidy speech about gratitude and endings, but she was already doing it without words, just presence. He realized then that dukedoms are inventions. Grace is the real inheritance. Radcliffe appeared at his side with a mug of ale and an unrepentant grin. "Well," he said, "if you wish to rehabilitate your legend, this will do. The people adore her. They may forgive you simply for marrying that much light." "I did not rehabilitate," Adrian said. "I surrendered." "Same verb in different tenses," Radcliffe answered, clapping his shoulder. "Go on. Say something before someone sings." Adrian stepped forward. The fiddle paused as if obeying choreography. The crowd turned, faces bright in lamplight, the scent of roasted apples and earth thick with promise. He raised his glass. "My friends," he began, and the word friends felt strange and correct. "You have worked harder than any contract could require, and you have forgiven faster than my reputation deserved. I used to think duty was a kind of armor. I have learned it is a kind of trust. Tonight we eat and drink as equals, because titles rust and harvest endures." He looked toward Arabella. "You know my wife. She has taught this house the grammar of mercy. It is time that mercy multiplied. Tomorrow we sell Ravensshire Manor. The proceeds will build schools for your children, a widow's fund for those who keep this county alive, and a home for those who have none. We will leave as we came into this world, unadorned but unashamed." A murmur swept the hall, half sorrow, half awe. Then applause broke like weather that has decided to be kind. The fiddler found his bow again. The music climbed. Someone started a reel. Someone else insisted on song. Arabella joined him at the dais, slipping her hand into his. "You forgot something," she murmured. "What?" "To tell them where we're going." He smiled. "Anywhere with you." Laughter and music blurred into a single warmth. Later, when the barn had emptied and lanterns burned low, they walked the fields one last time. The moon, polite as a guest, escorted them. The stubble underfoot whispered of next year's grain. The air carried the first rumor of frost. "This land will miss you," she said. "It will remember you," he answered. "I was merely its tenant." They reached the edge of the lake. Clara's garden glimmered in moonlight, alive now, roses heavy with dew instead of ghosts. Arabella knelt to touch one bloom, red as dawn. "We did it," she whispered. "We made peace grow." Adrian joined her, crouching so their reflections touched on the water. "You did it," he said. "I merely learned to stop killing what I loved." She laughed softly. "A useful habit." He drew her close. "I used to think redemption was a place one arrived. Now I know it's the road and the company." "And where does it end?" "At just a farm." He kissed her hair. "It doesn't." When dawn came, the tenants gathered again to see them off. The carriage stood ready. Trunks were fewer than one might expect from people who once owned so much. Arabella embraced the housekeeper, the steward, even the gardener who pretended to cough rather than cry. She left the keys on the newel post and the smell of roses in every hall. As they rolled away, the manor receded stone softening into memory. Adrian looked back only once. "Do you regret it?" "No," she said. "The walls can have their silence. We have the world's noise now." He took her hand and held it on his knee. "I owe you a life." She shook her head. "You owe me only time. The rest we'll build together." They reached the coast by evening. The sea received them like an old rumor finally come true. They found a cottage whitewashed by wind, roof thatched, garden patient. Inside was one room with a hearth and a table that promised breakfast. It was enough. That night, as tide hissed against the rocks, Adrian stood at the window watching the reflection of their candle float on the glass. Arabella came behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her chin on his shoulder. "Do you miss the title?" she asked. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Then I remember it never once called me by name. And now?" He turned, smiled. "Now I am simply a man who got lucky twice, once when you married me, and again when you stayed." "Hey," she kissed him, slow and sure. The sea kept its counsel, the wind approved. Later, when sleep found them, it did so without argument. Years later, travelers would speak of a painter by the cliffs who captured storms, as if apologizing for having caused them, and a woman who taught village girls to read and men to forgive. They never used titles. They never needed to. And sometimes, on still nights, the villagers heard music from the cottage fiddle and laughter, two voices singing a song no one else knew, built from 7 words that had changed history. "You'll never be my wife," he said once. "Until one kiss," she whispered back, changed everything.